effort with Clark Cagle and his Bonneville motor. As I mentioned, he went to Bonneville. He loved Bonneville. He was there early on with the Beach Ball Sanchez and Lakewood Muffler, and he owned Lakewood Muffler. He was a smoker with the guys from Bakersfield, and he was a wholesale muffler shop salesman for Oakey's Auto Parts. And then he ended up in Lakewood with his own muffler shop, and then subsequently a machine shop. But he ran that car and heard a streamliner, and it went fast. It went three and change, and not many people had gone 300 at that point. I think he set the record in B streamliner. And they parted company because Mylodon had expressed an interest to put a Ford in it, and Ford was going to pay the bills. So Clark said, "Okay, go do it." And he had this motor sitting on the stand in his garage. And I had been in and out I visited over there on a regular basis. He was around the corner from Mooneyham, and I would spend a lot of time at Mooneyham's with the four of them and stop at Clark's. I had a tour. In the evening I would go to various different shops and just visit with guys and then head on down the road. And Sutherland would go with me sometimes Pete Ogden, sometimes Cliff Harrison. Different guys we'd jump in my Nomad and go visiting, because we were all single, except for guys like Mooneyham who had a home and a life, such as it was. So Cagle said, "I'd like to try this thing in a dragster. What are you doing with yours?" I says, "Sitting in the garage. You want to use it? Bring it over." So I took it over there, and we freshened it up a bit and painted it a different color because the Scott would purge fuel when you shut it off, and the fuel got on that candy tangerine paint and ate it up. We didn't know about fuel proofing at the time. I knew about it with model airplanes, but I didn't know that nitro would do that. And so we repainted it a gold color and put fuel proofing in it so that it didn't get all hacked up. And we started running it, and it broke mostly at the starting line. It would backfire. Lions several times would pitch the ducts off, and the blower would get out of time because of the backfire and stuff like that. We never really had a big blower explosion as such. It would just pop. And of course that one popped because it had raw fuel laying in it, and it blew the case all apart. But that was the experience. The car ran good when it ran. But the transition from Bonneville to drag racing was a big one. And Clark didn't really have a lot of experience at the drag races with anything other than an Ardent. He ran an Ardent at the drag races years before that with Don Yates. And the early drag racing, the Cloudburst, which was that little pointy shaped dragster, it had the Clark's Ardent in it, and it was the first run to 144. And they was right in the hunt with Chrisman and with Art Chrisman and the Smoking White Owl, Ollie Morris, and Nesbitt's Orange. Those guys were all running at that point, right at between 140 and 150. And then once they got through 150, Busselbaum did it first, and then Mickey did it out here. And Clark's motor kind of, that was it. That was as fast as it would go. The Chrysler started taking over, and more people started using blowers. But it was the last front mount to run at the drag races. When guys like Potter and Doug Peterson see that motor with zoomy headers on a front mount motor, they go, "Wait a minute, that's incongruous. it doesn't fit. It's the wrong period." Anyway, we spent quite a few weekends, and we had a good time, and it ran good, it ran fast. And we went to the Mickey Thompson 200-mile-an-hour club meet, and there was a dance at the party relative to the meet, and the two finalists in the dance contest was me and Sid Waterman. And my dance partner was Michelle Hampshire. And I don't remember who Waterman's partner was, but he won. So I I don't have any claim to fame there. But we did get to the final. Then it's like going to the final round after all.
Sure.
As we left the last segment, we had mentioned a column that I had written that caused a great deal of consternation, I guess is the term. And I didn't have a copy with me, but I do now. And what I'd like to do is read it to the folks and by way of explanation, tell them who the players were. Because what happened initially is I wrote the column in regular reporting, and I used all the names and places and faces, and the publisher had a fit. And he says, I can't run this. I says, well, what if I do it in parable? He says, what's a parable? I says, it's kind of like in Old English, tale, that sort of thing. He says, well, send it and I'll see what I can do. Well, I wrote it and he published it. And so forthwith, here we are. It was titled The Legendary Tale of the Swift Merchants and the Scammers. Now, I'll explain how things get to where as I go through it. First of all, the Swift Merchants were speed equipment manufacturers. The Iskanderians, the Howards, all of those guys. The scammers were the guys who at that point were running SEMA. So we proceed. Once upon a time, in the middle of a vast and prosperous land, America of course, there were many chariot makers, car builders. They produced legions of chariots, and the people spent large number of shekels to acquire these chariots, and they covered the land. Many and varied as they were, some wanted their chariots to be different. And there were those noblemen who understood their desire and took hammer and tong in hand to forge adornments and devices to improve the chariots both in performance and appearance, and a need was fulfilled. They were called swift merchants, speed equipment manufacturers. They spawned a need for a means to tell the masses. Enter the parchment scribes, and they told the story. Peterson, Hot Rod Magazine. And the swift merchants became rich, and all was well. By and by, the bureaucrats that oversee chariots became disgruntled. EPA, DOT, NHTSA. And complained. It came to pass that because of these complaints, the noble Swifties became concerned and decided to rise up against the bureaucrats. They formed the Swift Merchants Band, that's the Speed Equipment Manufacturers Association, which they oversaw, and they hired other noblemen from their midst to fend off the threats that had arisen. The scribes carried their message far and wide, and they were successful. So successful, in fact, that the Swift Merchants members decided to hold a bazaar, the SEMA show. This bazaar was to be produced by one of the scribes, Peterson. In fact, the producing scribe even paid a large sum to hire a squire in the midst of the governing to represent the Swift Merchant members in the seats of the ruling, where the bureaucrats practiced their black art. This was Dale Hogue being hired from Washington to represent SEMA. Mm-hmm. Great sums were gathered to aid the band in their pursuit of the unjust, and that too was successful. Time passed, and many of the noble Swift merchants retired and passed on each enterprise to others as their day was done. And these sons and others who continued were not so noble. This was people who inherited the business and kept on going. Middlemen rose to power because the young Swift merchants were weak. The middlemen are the warehouses, the WDs. They threw out the scribe who produced the bazaar, and depose their steed, men of lesser nobility, men whose competence and character could be questioned, men who lacked ability and free enterprise and had failed many times. I'm not going to put his name. Now that I think he's still alive. And they changed the name of the Swift Merchants Band, speed equipment manufacturers, to a less meaningful name, Sellers, Creators, and Merchants, Scam, which placated the middlemen and included them in the governing of it. They had allowed the warehouses to become board members at SEMA. And there was grumbling in the midst of other swift makers about no say in their destiny. The scammers quickly beseeched the scribes to quiet this grumbling by making grandiose promises and telling of half-truths, and the scribes swallowed, and the disgruntled were quieted. Meanwhile, amidst the turmoil, the bazaar had become a source of great wealth, and the overseeing board of scammers decreed that their retinue, called the dupers, should be allowed to procure a spot of land and erect a castle of indolence with sufficient grounds to park their three-pointed, star-bedecked chariots, which were bought from lands far away with gold provided by the swift merchants. The board of scammers agreed. Again, the board of scammers met. This time, a lesser duper was allowed to be heard. A rotund duper with questionable character. A rotund duper with questionable character who beds not the fair maidens of the land, but those of his own kind. This duper proposed that the scammers provide gold to develop a tabloid magazine that would be produced in the Castle of Indolence by the dupers that would provide even greater wealth for the scammers. One board member did not agree, for it was in direct conflict with his livelihood as well as the many scribes members of the board. Many scribe members being the magazine that I was writing for was about to be about to face a new competitor in the way of an inside magazine at SEMA. And that's the whole issue, the crux of this matter. The duper showed little concern for the conflict of interest offered to purchase the names that he had for gold, and he did concede. He later chose not to sell the names, but that didn't change his vote. At the time, the dupers took greater and greater lies, told greater and greater lies, and were allowed by the board of scammers, as each was promised special treatment in the sale of their wares, and would receive special placement among the pages of the tabloid, something that cost extra in the member tabloids. As it came to pass, the dupers will have to report something negative. As it comes to pass, that they will have to report something negative about a member or give favorable comment to a non-member. This will anger perhaps the middleman or a member of the board of scammers, and there will be heads rolling, and deservedly so. That caused a great deal of consternation because most everybody that would read that in a trade magazine knew who the players were. And it was a big issue that SEMA was creating this magazine in opposition to somebody who was on the board, as a member and on the board, who produced a magazine that they were going to now have to compete with. And my reference to that was it went through the industry like a dose of salts. And there you have the rest of the story.